So Christians have always thought in terms of heaven, and even the church and even the Christian people generally as the city of God, the city of God. It's a metaphor for what we're doing right now. We live as a city in earthly cities, always aware that here we have no lasting city. It's there that the lasting city will be.
For a lot of people in the modern world, the city is a special place. It's where we do business. It's where we exchange ideas. It's where we go to concerts, plays, and restaurants. It's where we dress up, move fast, and feel important. It's where misfits fit in and where elites hold court. Every nation, kingdom, or empire touts the beauty of its metropolis. Every provincial capital aspires to greater prominence. Every lonely outpost dreams of becoming somewhere that matters. And despite widespread lament from good country people about urban libertinism, cities are still places where religion matters. Today, in America's largest city, New York, a Catholic tourist can walk from one end of Manhattan to the other, finding dozens of historic churches still fully operational. There are multiple options for making one's confession, attending Mass, sitting in on a Bible study, adoring Christ in the Eucharist, or just sitting alone and offering quiet prayers in a haven away from the chaos of bustling streets. A Catholic resident of such a city can do all these things and more, with rich faith communities sometimes going unnoticed alongside the more obvious secular diversions. As it happens, cities have always mattered to Christians, just as they mattered to our ancient spiritual forebears, Israel. Jerusalem was the intersection of heaven and earth, the only place where Israelites could sacrifice to the one true God. Rome transitioned from being the pagan capital of the greatest empire on earth to the spiritual home base of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Alexandria's famous library and literary culture brought us Philo, Clement, Origen, Athanasius, and Cyril. Carthage brought us Tertullian and Cyprian, along with the Latin Mass. Antioch was where people were first called Christians, but it was also a place known for riots and a vibrant nightlife made possible by streetlights. Cities have mattered so much to the people of God that the ultimate image in the Bible of eternal life with Christ is that of a heavenly city, the new Jerusalem that descends out of heaven to be the dwelling place of God and men. At the same time, earthly cities have come and gone. Our final hope lies beyond any of them, however grand or influential. To teach us more about the role of cities in the lives of early Christians, Ignatius Press has published an informative and delightful new book called Rabbles, Riots, and Ruins: 12 Ancient Cities and How They Were Evangelized, by Mike Aquilina. In this handy volume, we are invited into the sights, sounds, and sometimes smells of our forefathers in faith. A faith that took hold in some of the most important places in the known world. We traveled to expected destinations like Rome and Constantinople, but we also make surprise visits to places like Lugdunum in France and Echmiadzin in Armenia. We get a sense of the big picture of urban life in antiquity, the who's who's and the what's what's. But we also focus in on the details that made particular places ideal targets for the spread of the gospel. Mike Aquilina is a prolific author and also serves as the executive vice president of the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology. He is also contributing editor of Angelus News and general editor of the Reclaiming Catholic History series. He hosts the popular podcast, The Way of the Fathers, and he appears regularly on radio and television. It is my pleasure to welcome Mike Aquilina to the Ignatius Podcast now. Mike Aquilina, welcome to the Ignatius Press Podcast. How are you?
I'm doing fine, Andrew. Thanks for having me on. It's good to see you again.
It's good to see you again, too. I'm a longtime admirer of your work and glad to see you face to face again, albeit through the computer. Today, we're discussing a new book. You're such a prolific writer, so we know you have a lot of good material, new material out there. But the one we're talking about today is a new book from Ignatius Press that you've written that I really, really enjoyed reading, which is called Rabbles, Riots, and Ruins, which is a book about cities. Now, Mike, I love cities. I'm not really made for the country life, I have to admit. So I really enjoyed reading a book that has something good to say about cities, namely that it's because of cities that Christianity grew. And to some extent, it's important that Christianity still thrives in our cities. But you write about 12 cities of the ancient world that have particular relevance for our Christian faith. Some of them, no doubt, are ones everybody's heard of. And one or two of them, I think, are ones maybe very few people who pick up your book will have heard about. So why did you decide to choose the 12 that you chose?
Well, I wanted to have a variety. I wanted to have a mix. I wanted people to understand that Rome and Jerusalem and even Antioch and Alexandria were not the only cities in the ancient Christian world. We hear about those all the time. And they were important centers, intellectual centers, cultural centers, commercial centers, military centers. They had populations of Christians very early on, but so did some other cities that didn't stick around so long, that haven't remained on our mental map as long as Rome and Jerusalem have. Like Carthage, for example. Carthage was one of the great cities and great civilizations of the ancient world. And now no one knows about it. I wanted people to know about it. I wanted people to know that so much of the heritage you have as a Western Christian is from Africa. We've lost sight of our African heritage, but it was very important in the ancient world. It would have been one of the first things you talked about if you'd been having this conversation on Zoom in 200 AD. That's where you would go. You would go to Carthage in Africa. It would be one of those cities. So I wanted people to get a mix. I wanted them to know about the antiquity of the church in Armenia, for example, which has been culturally isolated for 2,000 years, but has been very important to our history. So there are all these little out-of-the-way places that you wouldn't ordinarily hear about or would even read about in a standard history of the church because they don't fit neatly into the narrative that centers on Rome or Jerusalem or Antioch or Alexandria.
Yeah. And, something that you touch on at the beginning of the book, Mike, is just how, we have this, when we think about St. Paul, for example, we might think, well, St. Paul is known for going to the ends of the earth, for going out there. But actually, really, when you look closely at the book of Acts, his strategy was he went to a city and he found the synagogue and he kind of went out went out from there. So I wonder if that's something that just in your work that you think, needs to be touted a bit more, that maybe people don't know so well.
Well, so many people have brought it out, but they're mostly academics. It's a trope right now in history that for a new movement, you need the kind of traction you get in a city, right? Because the city is a place where you can gather a number of social deviants in one place. Because if you're living in a small town, there might be one person who's thinking the way you are, maybe 3 persons at most, but really not enough to get traction, really not enough to get some momentum behind your movement. In a city, though, where there's a port and there are always people coming in and out, well, you might find more people who think the way you do, people who have encountered Jesus Christ, if you're a Christian deviant in this way. And so the cities were important centers. Now, I have to uh, raise a caution there. There's been a lot of research recently that pushes back against the urban hypothesis. Okay, and these people demonstrate using archaeology and the documentary record that that the rural areas grew just as quickly as the cities, and they're very persuasive. And I'm inclined to think they might be right. So I don't want to give the cities too much credit, but I think the cities were awfully important. And in any case, the cities were the places that left us the most information, because they tended to have the most vibrant literary culture. They left documents for us that to be read 2,000 years later. So I'm grateful to the cities and what they left behind.
Yeah, and for starting at the beginning with significant cities, your first chapter is about Jerusalem. Now, maybe this will give us a good opportunity to lay a little bit of theological groundwork in addition to historical groundwork, because of course Jerusalem has this sort of this theological significance in for eternity, in a sense. I mean, not necessarily the actual place on earth now, but there's the promise of the new Jerusalem. So even there, kind of in the promise of the hope of our faith, right, is this sort of urban idea. So I wonder if you could just take that and run with it and tell us a little bit about Jerusalem.
Well, again and again, we find scripture presenting heaven as a city, right? In the book of Revelation, we find it presented very clearly as God's holy city, right? Heaven is this place. It's a weird city. It's kind of shaped like a cube and all of these things. It's got water flowing out of it rather than into it, right? And it seems to be self-sufficient that way. So we have heaven presented as the perfect city, really, because God himself is the temple in heaven. It's unlike any other place on earth, but it's this form, this kind of like a Platonic form of what a city should be, and so Christians have always thought in terms of heaven, and even the church and even the Christian people generally as the city of God. The city of God. It's a metaphor for what we're doing right now. We live as a city in earthly cities, always aware that here we have no lasting city. It's there that the lasting city will be.
Mm-hmm. And Jerusalem, of course, is, just in actual historical terms, of course, the place where Jesus was crucified, resurrected, ascended. It's the place where the Holy Spirit was poured out upon the church, right? So in a way, it's the starting point. But very quickly, we see things spread. And the next chapter of your book is about Antioch, where you remind us that that's where people were first called Christians.
Right.
So tell us about Antioch a little bit.
Well, Antioch was a city founded by one of the generals of Alexander the Great. Alexander, conquered the world before his 30th birthday, but he promptly died, and he left this vast empire to be carved up by his senior military staff, and they did. Each one took one of these quarters of his empire and established a kingdom there. And so we have in Antioch the Seleucid Empire and the Seleucid dynasty, and it becomes an important city. It becomes a military center, commercial center, and also an intellectual center. And the reason I wanted to write this book is because each one of these cities seemed to have a personality to it, a very different personality from all of the others. It stood out. That's one of the reasons I got down to this dozen cities and that are in the book. And Antioch really did have this vital, diverse population. Even the Jews in Antioch needed to have many, many synagogues, because the Jews, even among themselves, were divided and diverse in Antioch. Antioch was also a city known for its humor, its comedy. right? So the people like to have a good time. They like to laugh. One of my favorite scenes from ancient history is when the Emperor Julian the Apostate, he was an ex-Christian and he wanted to repaganize the empire. Well, he decided to use Antioch as his base of operations, and the people just mocked him openly. You know, they would shout out jokes while he was announcing the latest step in his agenda to repaganize the empire. And so much of Julian's time there was comical anyway, because the pagan religions were in such disarray. The aristocrats who managed those religions and served as its priestly caste, well, they had fallen upon hard times, right? They weren't as rich as they used to be. They were always walking around in dirty robes, followed along by their pet duck or whatever. And there are all these comical scenes we get from the city of Antioch, and I have to think it's because the people of Antioch had an eye for that kind of comedy and preserved it well. So Antioch had a personality. It also was urban in a way we think of cities today. And why is that? Well, because early in the first century, Herod the Great, you know, the king who was ruling Palestine at the time, decided that he was going to give a gift to Antioch, and he was going to build this boulevard. Herod was a master architect, and he designed the first city, wide, broad city with the markets along it, illuminated by streetlights. It was the first urban street to be lit by street lamps, and it became a model for all of the other cities in the empire. They wanted to catch up with that. They wanted to have a nightlife, right? Mm-hmm. And this is invented really in Antioch, the idea of a nightlife that's lit up by street lamps. I love that image. And it's from roughly the time of our Lord. Antioch would have been known for that, known for its intellectual vitality, known for its diverse population, and its lively conversations among religious people.
This is something that really comes through in so many chapters in your book, how you really paint the picture of what life would have been like in some of these places. And just one last thing on Antioch, you know, I love how you remind us that John Chrysostom got his start in Antioch, and the Antiochenes they loved to hoot and holler.
Yes.
And he liked receiving the hooting and hollering when he preached well.
Yes. So you can see that kind of showbiz vitality that was there in Antioch, and even the great preachers, the greatest preacher of all time, John Chrysostom, indulged in this a bit. Mm-hmm. He knew that he was the best entertainment in town, and he even admitted that he couldn't help but play to the applause that he got in church. Yeah. I love Antioch. I love all of these cities.
Yeah. And we'll come to kind of the way the intellectual life kind of rippled out from Antioch in some important ways in a second. But I want to touch on Rome for a moment. That will be one of the chapters that obviously everyone has heard of Rome, and maybe many readers have been to modern day Rome. But what is there for us to learn today about ancient Rome in terms of just the earliest days of Christianity? I mean, I learned a few things here. For example, that the Christian community there was basically Greek speaking, correct? Instead of Latin speaking.
Yes. You would think that it would be Latin speaking, but no, Rome was a cosmopolitan city. Greek was still the common language of the world, and Greek was spoken among the elites in Rome. Latin was the native religion, really, to the area, but it wasn't the official language just yet. It certainly wasn't the official language of the church. You know, the earliest writings we have from Rome are written in Greek. We have Clement of Rome from very early in Roman history, right? In Roman Christian history. Clement of Rome, one of the early popes, I believe his letter comes from around 67 AD. It was certainly no later than 97 AD. It was in the first century, and he's writing in Greek at length. We have the writings of Justin Martyr, and people think of Justin as someone who died in Rome, who had a school in Rome, who trained philosophers in Rome. But Justin himself spoke Greek, the Greek that was still the language in his native Palestine. So yeah, it's a curiosity. It's something that actually I didn't realize for some time, until sometime after I started reading the Fathers.
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting fact, and there's a lot more. One more thing that I thought that I'd point out or ask you a little bit more about Rome when we talk about Constantinople in just a moment. But something interesting about Rome that maybe a lot of people don't realize is Christianity really began to flourish there because at the same time that the empire really moved away from there. In a sense, I mean, where the focal point sort of went east.
Yes.
Do you think that's significant? That's kind of the way in which the rest of the Christian world began to look to the Bishop of Rome, and Rome, really began to sort of be the focal point for the faith. The way that obviously it's still this important city, but that it has a little bit of distance, I guess, from some of the operations of the empire.
Yeah, I think it's very important. I think it's fairly clear from the documentary record and from the archaeological record that that Rome was central to the early church. But at that time, you have a persecuted church. You can't have Rome micromanaging everything in the distant lands, right? Rome was still remote. It was the capital, and there was a lot of traffic going back and forth between the capital and the provinces. But still, it's a distance. And yet Rome was ruling the earth, ruling the church all over the earth. That's clear from the letter of Clement to the Corinthians, where you find a bishop of Rome disciplining a distant congregation, a congregation that was in Greece, and giving them kind of fatherly guidance about how to get beyond this sticky situation that they're in. We find that 100 years later, 100 years after that letter was sent, it was still being read within the liturgy. So it was being treated by the Corinthians as scripture, because it came from the Pope of Rome. Ignatius of Antioch treats Rome like it's the center of the earth. And again, you see over and over again that the greatest of the early fathers believed that they had to make pilgrimage not to the Holy Land, but to Rome. Mm-hmm. So many of the ancient fathers found their way there, and you see that in Polycarp, in Irenaeus, in Origen. All of them made their way to Rome. Rome had a certain centrality and preserved that centrality in the church once the administrative capital had moved east to Byzantium, to Constantinople.
Yeah. And we'll pick that up in a moment on Constantinople. But first, let's stop in Alexandria, because here's where, I love the chapter in the book, because this is where you really show how Alexandria was this place where you mentioned before kind of intellectual, figures sort of like to gather in cities. But boy, howdy, were they in Alexandria. I mean, you have Philo, you have, Origen, you have all of these figures. You have the famous library there. I mean, what a place in the history of the world Alexandria was.
Oh, yeah. It would be like Cambridge is today in the United States, where you have Harvard and MIT, all of these things going on. You have great bookstores everywhere. You have these university libraries, so to speak. There was research going on in the sciences that was amazing in Alexandria. There was a large Jewish population, and it was a very educated Jewish population. It had all of the elements to become the intellectual capital of the Christian world, and it did. It did fairly early on. So here we have this great center of thought, and again, like Carthage, which I mentioned before, it's there in northern Africa.
Yeah. And here I think is a good place to pause too and just say something briefly. Obviously, your book isn't so much about kind of the different schools of biblical interpretation. That's another book. But in the ancient world, there developed these two kind of famous schools of biblical interpretation, the one in Antioch and the one in Alexandria. And they both had enormous implications and effects on the early church. I wonder if we could just pause a moment and you could just explain to us a little bit about what that situation is between those two great intellectual centers and the way that they read the Bible.
Well, there was a strong rivalry between the two cities, and when historians talk about Antioch and Alexandria, they'll sometimes exaggerate the differences in their biblical in their approaches to biblical interpretation. They did have a lot in common. The difference that most people recognize is that the Alexandrians seemed to favor a figural interpretation of the Bible. Uh, an allegorical interpretation of the Bible, and sometimes would emphasize that even over the literal meaning of the text. Now, in places like Antioch and in the subsequent Western tradition, you find an insistence on the literal historical meaning of the text as the foundation, the thing that you have to settle first before you go on to a figural or allegorical interpretation. Sometimes the Alexandrians just dove right into the allegory, and they wove pretty intricate allegories that were sometimes hard to track. You read them in some passages from Origen, for example, and they go on for pages, and they can be hard to keep track of.
Yeah, it's just interesting, and there will be kind of future theological debates that play out in some respects because of these different ways of reading Scripture, to be sure. Before leaving Alexandria, maybe we could say something about the Septuagint, which is this, the famous Greek Bible, right? That came about in Alexandria. I don't know if there's more to say except just to kind of note that as a really important thing that came into existence.
Well, it's one of those indicators of the prestige of Alexandria in the intellectual world. The king there in Egypt wanted to have every book that had been published in his library, and he wanted them in his language, in Greek. So he asked the Jews to produce an edition of their scripture for him to have in the library. Okay, this is the story as we've received it anyway, and according to the story, 70 translators produced this translation, and it became the foundation, really, for the religious practice of Jews in the dispersion, in the diaspora, and then it became the foundation for Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. This is the version of the Bible that we find quoted most often in the New Testament. It's the version of the Old Testament we find most quoted in the New Testament and in the fathers of the church themselves.
Yeah, and the early Christians did not have to, they could if they wanted to, but they didn't have to believe the miraculous origin story of the 70 translators producing the same document in order to recognize the value of the Greek Old Testament, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Let's talk about Ephesus. What an intriguing place. I mean, a place that essentially doesn't exist anymore, except as a tourist stop, but was so important for so many reasons. Tell us about it in kind of the earliest days of the church.
Well, you think about it, it's there in the Acts of the Apostles, right? Paul wrote a letter to the Ephesians too. And you find that so many of the greats of the New Testament era spent time there. Okay, Paul and the Blessed Virgin Mary and Saint John and all of these people spent time living there and working there. And if you go to the next generation and the next generation after that, you find many of the great names of whatever generation you're in were residents of Ephesus, right? This was a major center. I love the scene in the Acts of the Apostles, and that's what I led with in the book. The scene in the Acts of the Apostles where there's a riot because of the silversmiths who say that Paul is taking all their business away because Paul's preaching this exclusive worship for Jesus, so the people have stopped buying their little silver tchotchkes of Diana of the Ephesians, right, with the great temple there. So it's one of those early riots that are presented to us most vividly, and that's a theme that keeps coming up in my book of 12 Cities. This theme of rioting right? Because it was something that frequently happened in the ancient world, and especially in the ancient cities, where there were populations concentrated in one place, and sometimes populations with divergent ideas, religious ideas, political ideas, and sometimes they were egged on by politicians, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is an early example of that kind of riot, and we'll find other examples as we go forward in the book. But boy, so I was talking about Ephesus. You can lose your place here. And Ephesus was one of the great cities. It gets one of the letters to the churches in the book of Revelation. It's obviously very important to the Christian church worldwide in the first century, and in the second century, the third century, and even into the fourth century. So this is an amazing thing. In the fifth century, there's a council there, the Council of Ephesus, that decides on an important question of church doctrine.
Well, I love, Mike, if I could just interject, I love how when you tell the story about the riot of the silversmiths,
yes,
and this comes up in a number of chapters in the book, you remember that the efforts of evangelization were not just, the obstacles were not just sort of philosophical, or, that there were already other gods being worshipped or whatever. I mean, there are always these practical concerns, like the community there is like, what's going to happen to our businesses if people start worshiping this other god, right?
And history turns on these things. Mm-hmm. Nowadays we look back on history and we like to think of it as an orderly progression of ideas. The church fathers met in councils and they made decisions, and it all went by in an orderly way. They put out a document, and this doctrine, was proclaimed as official, and we all lived happily ever after. And that's not the way it went. History turned on riots, and history turned on these economic matters, the concerns of the silversmiths. History turned because of the fact that people in cities lived in close proximity to each other, and there were no social media for them to have an electronic buffer between them, right?
Yeah.
They were always out in the street having that interchange, right? They were always out in the street to buy something. They'd get stopped on the street, have a conversation. It could end in an argument. The argument could end in a riot. So these are things that were very real issues there, practical issues. It's important for us to understand the way the world turned back then. Yeah. Because we have things that are analogous to this now, but they're not exactly like it. I apologize for just petering out on that last question. Just asking about Ephesus creates a traffic jam in my brain because of all of the great things that happened there in very early Christian history, and the fact that it did fall off the map.
Yeah.
It was an important see, an apostolic see, all right? It's an important New Testament center of the church. And eventually, its lampstand was taken away, to borrow the language of the book of Revelation. They lost the Christian faith. If it's hard to find a Christian church in Ephesus that isn't a ruin, right? Today, the whole city is a ruin. And for a long time, the see itself was just a vacant titular see that would be given to a bishop in the West, for example, who would never visit Ephesus. But today it's an archaeological park, and we can go and see the ruins and marvel at them and wonder that a city so great could fall.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the most intriguing chapters in the book. And, in the next chapter, you have another great example of the way, Christianity spreads in these sort of unusual ways that we wouldn't, it's not just so linear, like, oh, people had a great idea and they talked about it in a council or whatever. And it's your chapter on Edessa, where I had never heard this story before. And I know the readers are going to love reading your story about King Abgar, I believe is his name. And there's a wild origin story of his correspondence with Jesus Christ.
Well, that's right. And what's interesting about that story is it seems kind of implausible, right? And I'm kind of skeptical about it myself, right?
Yes.
But but the story itself was important to the identity of the people in Edessa, which was a major city on the border between the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire. So Edessa is a very important history because it was in that frontier of the empire. Sometimes it belonged to Persia, sometimes it belonged to Rome, and whichever power had it, it was distrustful of Edessa because it was a borderland, because it was the place where the spies would naturally congregate. And sometimes the Christians were suspected of being those spies. Just because they were Christian, they were outsiders. Just because they live in Edessa, which was a frontier city. So it was an interesting place. What we find is that later kings were so proud of that story of Abgar corresponding with Jesus that they kind of chiseled it into stone.
Yeah.
And put it there in the city walls in stone, and those stones still survive today after all these centuries, after more than a millennium. Those stones still survive. What's interesting though is that a historian as serious and as critical as Eusebius took that story as plain truth, historical. He did not hesitate at it.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting example of, again, whether, okay, so Eusebius said it was true, and that's significant, very significant. Yeah. Today, we don't have to believe that it was true, but we can still give thanks to God that for whatever reason, that story was allowed to proliferate, and the people were Christian. They said we're Christian because we have this really interesting history, and and so it went. And now you point out in that chapter too that's an example of this kind of variety of Syriac Christianity too, that probably a lot of readers won't know very much about, kind of the Syriac language and just what that meant.
Well, it was a Semitic culture like the one Jesus lived in, and it used a language that was a close kin to the language Jesus used. There were many Jews who shared that culture, and many of the rabbis at that time were in dialogue, and a rather intense dialogue, with the Syriac church. So it formed, according to different cultural standards, it formed in very different ways, deeply Semitic ways. So we find a Christian religion that resonates strongly with the Old Testament types, the Old Testament figures, that is very knowledgeable of all of these types and figures and of the history of the Jewish people, and is clearly in dialogue with them.
Yeah,
that's something that's very clear, is that there was this Jewish Christian dialogue going on in places like Edessa from very, very early in history. It helps us to understand also the Syriac churches that still survive today. These are important churches, especially in India and in the Middle East, and they have this deeply Jewish feel to them, this deeply Semitic spirit about them, and you read the ancient writers in this tradition, like Ephraim and Afrahat, and you encounter a very poetic articulation of the faith that's quite different from what you'll find in Ambrose and Augustine, who were poets, but did not quite achieve this level of poetic diction and intricacy as the Syriac fathers.
Yeah. Well, after this foray to the east, let's move west. Now, if you were to keep telling your story of more cities, maybe moving a few centuries further in, you probably would be telling the story of a lot more Western European cities. But we're still early. We're still very early in the life of the church in your book. But we do have some Western European cities, and one of them is the French city of Lyon, which was called Lugdunum, I believe, in the ancient world. What's the significance of that so early on in the life of the church in those first few centuries?
Yeah, well, it has huge significance. It was a city that was inland. It was on a river, right? But the river led to the sea, and it was a navigable river. So a lot of goods and services, had to pass through Lugdunum in order to get into Europe. right? That was there seemed to be a common relationship between Lugdunum and distant ports like Smyrna, right? So many of the Christians we know about who came to the West seem to have come by way of Lugdunum. They came. They came there. They stayed there. Irenaeus of Lyon was originally a disciple of Polycarp of Smyrna, right? But somehow he ends up becoming bishop of the city in Gaul, in France, and an important figure in the church. We look at the records from that time, and it seems that this was a common trade route, that there was a certain relationship between the cities, and it had a real cosmopolitan character at the time.
And of course, at this time, there were all kinds of heresies all about, right? And there was Arianism, there were different forms of Gnosticism, and it was here in this place, in Lyon, in Lugdunum, that Irenaeus wrote, kind of the definitive ancient work, sort of dispelling the flaws, I guess, in the ancient heresies, right?
Well, whenever you have an important port city, you're going to have not only goods coming in and going out, you're going to have ideas coming in and going out. You're going to have religions arriving and some of them staying. So you're going to have a proliferation of ideas and sects and all of that sort of thing. And so Irenaeus was encountering so many of these emerging Gnostic variants on the Christian theme. You can't really call them religions because they changed so rapidly. They would metastasize, really, because they would spread, and as they spread, they changed. Gnosticism didn't discipline itself by texts so much, but by the enlightened individual, the enlightened teacher. And no two of these enlightened teachers could agree on anything. Was Jesus human, fully human or not? Was he fully divine or not? Who exactly was he? What did he teach? Was the flesh any good? A little good? Not good at all? All of these things were options among the Gnostics. And so Irenaeus saw this going on in his time, and he saw he saw that it had become a parasite on the church because the Gnostics were not really evangelizing their pagan neighbors. They were evangelizing people who were already Christian and offering them a more elite kind of Christianity, trying to flatter them, saying that you're smarter than all that scripture stuff. Come on this way. We'll show you something better, and you're going to be part of the enlightened few. And people responded to that. Irenaeus saw the danger in that kind of appeal, and he did something about it. He wrote, this multi-volume work refuting all of the different varieties of Gnosticism that he knew about in his time, and they were many.
And still such a valuable work today, and worth everybody checking out. Let's talk about the next city. I know we're pressing on here. We're not going to have time to talk about everything in the whole book, but the chapter you wrote about Echmiadzin in Armenia, I don't think very many people are going to have known about this place when they pick up your book, but it's such an important place. Tell us why.
Oh man. Well, first of all, I should have spent about an hour rehearsing some of the names from Armenia, because Armenian is a language so different from our own. And it has I think it's like 10 or 12 additional letters that we don't have in our alphabet because we don't really have those sounds in our language. So yeah, people don't know about Armenian Christianity. They don't know about Armenian culture. And unfortunately, they don't know about the persecution of the Armenian people that has been so intense now for hundreds of years. They've been persecuted by the Turks. They were persecuted by the communists. They have suffered so much. They continue to suffer in our own day. You talk about genocide. It's still going on. You talk about forced migration. It's still going on. It's going on in Armenia, and people don't know about this. And this is one of the oldest Christian peoples. These are the people who were the first to become the first to adopt Christianity as the state religion of, for everyone. So it's an important place in Christian history. But again, it's like Edessa and Lugdunum and some of those others in our new world order, in our current world order. Those places just aren't as important. Other cities have eclipsed them. So we don't have any knowledge of their history, their importance in our heritage. We're not aware that they're there.
Yeah. And this chapter is another great example of where you tell the story of how Christianity came to this place through a great kind of human drama of these two orphan boys. And
yes.
It's really, really compelling reading that runs all through your book. I really enjoyed that.
Now that one, we'd need an hour just to talk about the story. Yeah. But the thing is, the story is so outlandish. Mm-hmm. If you were writing a novel, you'd say, that's not credible. I'm going to put that aside. But the story is fairly well documented in the ancient world. Yeah. So it's one of these crazy things that history preserves, even though it seems kind of unbelievable.
Yeah, and that we'll leave that as a tease for readers, because it is such a good story, but a little bit complicated. So, but really, really compelling. All right, let's touch on the other cities in the time that remains just briefly. Constantinople. My big takeaway in your chapter about that is, such an interesting story about the foundation of that city and everything, but in some respects, kind of a cautionary tale about what happens when Christianity gets all tangled up in the official apparatus of the state.
That's right. That's right. You have Caesar thinking that he should be Pope. You have Caesar promoting the interests of Caesar within the church. You have Caesar playing the theologian, sometimes doing it well, sometimes not so well. There are quite a number of emperors who dabbled in heresy and tried to impose it on the church at large, sometimes succeeding for decades. So there is a cautionary tale there.
Yeah. Let's hit on Milan and Ravenna together, two cities in Italy. Why are they so important to us now?
Well, they're important because they were capital cities. Rome was not defensible, and there was a need to move the administrative capital away from a place so vulnerable, and so first the Romans moved their administrative and military center to Milan, to be up there near the front, near the place where the action was, where the barbarians would be pressing to get into Italy. Later on, they wanted to move away from the danger and really protect the emperor, and so they moved to Ravenna, which was a very defensible city. It was surrounded by swamps, like Washington D.C. today. Mm-hmm. It was a place where you could keep things safe. It was such a good climate, so to speak, for keeping the city safe, that the city never suffered a serious sacking through all these centuries. So when you walk into those 5th century churches that are in Ravenna, you can see the churches as they were in the 5th century, with the same artwork still on the walls, with all the mosaic tesserae still in place. Mm. You can see what the church fathers saw when they walked into those churches, because Ravenna has been so well preserved down the centuries.
That's fascinating. Lots more in that chapter. Your 12th city is Carthage. I learned a lot from that chapter as well. And my biggest takeaway is, hey, people, if you like the Latin Mass, you have Africa to thank.
That's true. And I want people to know that heritage is largely Carthaginian, is largely African. It's quite possible that we were not using a Latin liturgy in the city of Rome until the middle of the 4th century. We don't really have a record of it before then. Mm-hmm. But it was certainly being used in Africa. The earliest Latin literature that we have in the church, the earliest Christian Latin literature, emerged from Africa, and it was amazing work. The work of Tertullian, Perpetua, Cyprian, so many great names in the fathers of the church were Carthaginians, were Africans, and of course the greatest of them all, in my opinion, Augustine. He was an African. And this is our heritage.
Hmm. Well, we're agreed on our admiration for Augustine, and you definitely highlight his importance in that chapter. Obviously, he's important in the kind of Milan chapter, but really, really important in the Africa part in Carthage. So, really terrific to see him highlighted there. Lastly, Mike, so, places are important. Beautiful buildings are important. All this stuff is super important. And we don't believe that creation is just destined for the trash can, right? I mean, we believe that we're called to be good stewards and build beautiful things and wonderful things that reflect and reveal the glory of God. And places are where we are. We're embodied souls. And, this is where we live our lives, right? But ultimately, as you've pointed out, I mean, some of these cities that you've written about don't exist anymore. And maybe, sadly, some of the other ones that still do exist in future centuries may not exist anymore either. So, what's kind of the takeaway when we think about physical places and these great cities?
Well, as I quoted before from the letter to the Hebrews, here we have no lasting city. And I'm someone who's a nerd and who likes to visit these distant places. This year, I'll be making 2 pilgrimages in the fall, leading 2 pilgrimages to Italy to walk in these ruins. But you know what? They're ruins.
Mm-hmm.
They no longer serve as churches. We're going to be walking through these places, venerating the saints who were there, but they're no longer living churches. These blocks that were set one upon another by a previous generation. And this is a lesson to us because we see it happening in our own day, where we have to close so many urban parishes because the populations, or at least the Catholic populations, have moved away from the city center. Okay. This is happening again and again. And we find that we have to let go of churches that were beautiful and churches that were beloved and that were built by our forefathers in this country. Well, that's something that our ancestors had to suffer as well, because cities do come and cities go. As you pointed out before, Ephesus is an archaeological park. There's nothing new happening in Ephesus. There's no cultural life there anymore. It's just kind of trapped in amber so that we can see it as it was in the time of the saints, the fathers, the figures of the New Testament.
Yeah, still so much to learn from these places. And there's so much to learn about these places from your new book, which is Rabbles, Riots, and Ruins, 12 Ancient Cities and How They Were Evangelized, which is now available from Ignatius Press, wherever you get your books. Mike Aquilina, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. It's an honor.